There's been so much talk about born-again Christianity that not too long ago, the Gallup poll made a survey, and they discovered that there were 1 out of 3 adults in the United States over the age of 18, adults that claim to have a born-again experience, born-again Christianity. And when we got that report and the initial elation that we might have had, we began to maybe think, well, where are they? And as we think about the impact on society, the major facets of society, the home, education, government, the media, entertainment, labor, the professions, we do ask ourselves, where are we as born-again Christians? Our Lord said that we are to be the light of the world, the salt of the earth, and yet when we look at the very little impact that all of these professing born-again Christians are having upon our society, when we look at the home and the disintegration of the home on every side, when we look at the continuing skyrocketing of crime, when we look at the widespread pornography through films, and we look at what's going on in television, so much of it, and literature, and we ask ourselves about our educational system which was born out of biblical principles, born out of the church, God-fearing men and women. And yet today, to such a heavy extent, having turned its back on Jesus Christ as Lord and promoting the religion of secular humanism. And we obviously draw some conclusions. One conclusion is that not all is gold that glitters. Not everyone is born again that claims to be born again. And yet when we come down to our situation, if indeed we claim to be born-again Christians, which I assume just about everybody here does, that our commitment, our availability to Jesus Christ still is not what it ought to be, is still lacking. And what he wants, of course, for us to do in order for us to have the impact on society is to be abandoned to him. J.B. Phillips, in his introduction to his translation, Letters to Young Churches, speaks directly to this issue. He said, "The great difference between present-day Christianity and that of which we read in these letters is that to us it is primarily a performance. To them it was a real experience. We are apt to reduce the Christian religion to a code, or at best a rule of heart and life. To these men, it is quite plainly the invasion of their lives by a new quality of life altogether. They do not hesitate to describe this Christ as living in them. Perhaps if we believed what they believed, we might achieve what they achieved." And so this morning, as we look at this passage together, we're going to consider some of the implications of this supernatural, vital faith in Jesus Christ, this born-again experience, which is an experience of supernatural grace from God in walking with him. If you look in your insert in the bulletin, we'll look at the review of chapters 9 through 11 very quickly together. Make sure that we know where we are in our passage and that we're putting some of this together as we have segmented it, obviously, through several weeks together. But as I said last Sunday, there are 2 major thrusts in these chapters 9 through 11. As the seeming discrepancy between Paul's message of the gospel and Jewish unbelief is considered. And again, the question is, what has happened to the Jews? Is God through with the Jews? Has God's word about these special promises, this special covenant relationship with the Jews, has it failed? And obviously it hasn't. And so Paul, in his argument under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, takes it in 2 directions. One direction is that if the Jews are rejected, at least for this time, It's because they rejected God and his Messiah. If God seems faithless, it is not really because he's faithless, it's because the Jews were unfaithful. That's threaded through chapters 9 and 10. The other direction that it goes in is that God's promises to Israel, the integrity of them, are maintained because God never intended that every Jew would be the recipient of the promise, of these covenant promises to Abraham. But only those who were the elect, only those that by the grace of God exercised faith and instead of unbelief and being saturated with legalism instead of coming by grace through faith. And yet the special promises about Israel as a nation still are in the plan of God and still will be unfolded in history. And chapter 11 deals with that. We are dealing with that fairly directly this morning. And that is that there is a time still in the future when the nation itself not only will be regathered into the land, but will be delivered spiritually. There will be this resurgence of Israel as a spiritual and political entity. And God will fulfill his promises to them in a very direct way where they will become the center of world government, out of which will flow blessing to the entire earth. And this is when Jesus Christ returns in his millennial kingdom. And so these subjects are being dealt with here. And the outline breaks this down as you can read that over for yourself on your own. But breaking it down point by point or paragraph by paragraph, this outline is the most concise and brief one that I came across, that I have included there in the bulletin for you, so that you will have some idea of what has been going on here by way of review. Now, chapter 11, we saw in verses 1 through 10 that Israel's failure was not total. There still has been this remnant all the way through history. Not every Jew has been rejected because the nation itself in the first century rejected their Messiah. There have been always ones out of the majority. The minority, the remnant, have come to Christ. And so the failure of the Jews has not been total historically, nor today, nor has the Jews' failure been final. And this is what we're dealing with. We dealt with it last Sunday. We continue on this morning, that it's only temporary. It's not permanent. That this whole thing of Israel being in the center of God's will is still a future thing. Now, continuing the argument of the Jews' failure not being final, we come into verse 16, and two analogies are used here. One is that of the first piece of the dough, and the other is that of the branches from the olive tree. But first of all, we see the first piece, or first fruit. It's the same word there in the original language. And this was a small portion of the newly kneaded lump of dough. And the argument there is that, of course, from the Old Testament offering system, and this is taken from the book of Numbers, that this small portion was taken out of the original lump of dough that was being kneaded, and then it was baked and it was offered to the Lord in this offering system. And since that was acceptable, since that was wholly acceptable and belonged to the Lord, then the rest of the lump out of which it came is wholly acceptable, belonging to the Lord. And so the people which came from these godly forefathers, and the lump, that small portion of the entire lump, this small portion that it's talking about here, the first piece of the dough being holy, is referring to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and so on, the patriarchs. They were holy. They were especially set aside and belonged to the Lord. And because out of them, because they were such, the rest of the lump is also considered such. The people which came from these godly forefathers of the covenant form a whole with the patriarchs. And so God still has a plan for the nation as a whole. And that again is future. They still are ones who belong to the Lord, and these special purposes and this special acceptation is still there. And this is what this analogy is conveying. The second part of verse 16 also is conveying the same point. If the root be holy, the branches are too. And the root again is Abraham, the patriarchs, and then the branches refer to the whole nation. And this, of course, is not talking about individuals here, but it's talking about the nation. You need to keep that in mind as this passage unfolds. It's not talking primarily about individuals, but about the nation as a whole, or generations of the nation. In summary, the believing forefathers of the Jewish people sanctify the whole covenant posterity in the sense that they are destined to fulfill God's purpose as a covenant nation. They still belong to the Lord. Even as we have here, if they come from the root, then they still have this relationship with the root. Or if they come from this lump of dough, they still have this belongingness and acceptability. And this is something that I believe since 1948, the Christian world has become much more alert to. Previous to that time, 1948, of course, when Israel regathered as a political entity, many who took the Bible seriously interpreted these passages about Israel in a non-literal sense, in a non-normal sense. They spiritualized these passages and said, well, this obviously Israel was through as a nation in 70 A.D. They've been scattered to the four corners of the earth. And all of these promises that were given to Israel in the Old Testament, they're symbolical. And the church is equated with Israel. We, in that method of interpretation, become the new Israel. And these things are spiritualized, symbolized. And yet there were many that did not symbolize them or spiritualize them, but believed that that was literal. But since the regathering of Israel as a nation in the land, as a political entity in 1948, there has been some re-examination by much of those who take the Bible seriously. And most of us, I believe, today believe that Israel will be literally, and already is being before our eyes as far as we know it. It may not be that this is God's permanent regathering, or there may be some ups and downs in that, but at the same time, we have been very impressed with the fact that here's a nation that for 1900 years has not been a political entity. They've been scattered throughout the entire earth, maintained their identity, and now have regathered as a political entity. That's unheard of, unparalleled in history that anything like this has ever happened. And this indeed has happened. Another thing that we need to keep in mind is that if we use the literal or the normal method of interpretation about the rest of what's in the Bible, then we should use it when it talks about these passages that talk about Israel's future. And it's an inconsistent use of the method of interpretation to symbolize this. This passage itself is talking about a literal regathering, as well as throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament is this emphasis. Now verses 17 through 24 continue the figure of the tree with its roots and branches. And there's some warnings here about our attitudes. And this is referring again to Gentiles. It's not primarily referring to us as individuals, but it's talking about Gentile Christianity. And a lot of Gentile Christianity has not been real Christianity. It's been a form of godliness, but denying the power thereof. And the words that are being spoken here include both elements, the genuine Christianity as well as the nominal Christianity. And it's talking about Gentile Christianity in general and not about us as individuals specifically. But there's some real attitudes that we're being warned about here. And we pick this up at verse 17. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you being a wild olive were grafted in among them, that is among Israel, the original root there of the patriarchs of Judaism, and became partaker with them of the rich root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant toward the branches, these branches that were removed. Don't be arrogant toward the Jews because of their unfaithfulness, because of their rejection of their Messiah. Don't be arrogant toward them. And Now you notice in verse 17 there's two kinds of branches. The original, the Jewish people, most of whom have been broken off because of their unbelief in God's promise. And we see that more specifically in verse 20, quite right. They were broken off for their unbelief. And then, secondly, the wild olive branches are Gentile Christians. Again, I believe it includes the nominal as well as the genuine believers. As it develops there, particularly Gentile believers, genuine believers, but they were grafted into the covenant family of God as a whole. And Paul warns the Gentiles here not to gloat, not to have this self-sufficient attitude. Well, you know, we now are God's special people, and we are in the center and the limelight of all of His blessing and so on. And so the first warning of pride is in verse 18. Do not be arrogant against the branches, but if you are arrogant, remember that it is not you who supports the root, but the root supports you. In other words, we came from Judaism. We came from Jewish background and beliefs as far as our Christian faith is concerned, not the other way around. And C.S. Lewis put it this way. In a sense, the converted Jew is the only normal human being in the world. Everyone else is, from one point of view, a special case dealt with under emergency conditions. So we need to view ourselves as a special case that kind of got in the back door. And only because God's chosen people originally turned against Him, rejected Him and His Messiah. And the repercussions of that. Of course, that went on generation after generation in Israel's history, even before the coming of the Messiah, so often. And so this ought to engender some humility on our part as we view ourselves as simply wild olive branches who have been grafted in rather than being part naturally of that root. And the second warning is given in verses 19 through 22. You will say then, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. Quite right. They were broken off for their unbelief, because of the Jews' unbelief. They were broken off, and you stand only by your faith. Do not be conceited, but fear. Again, this real warning about pride, of conceit, of somehow congratulating ourselves because we are the people of God and so to speak, resting on our laurels. And you study the history of Christianity, the history of the church, and you see that this has happened over and over and over and over again. And God has allowed that nominal Christianity to be swept away. Vital Christianity comes, and then the cycle over and over again. And so here is a warning here that the only reason we stand is not because of our family background or the heritage, the tradition, and so on, but because of faith, vital saving faith. And again, we are to be balanced, that it's only because of God's mercy that we are partakers of anything that God has to offer us of any worth at all. God's mercy is something that comes not that we can assume or presume upon, but as we put simple faith in Jesus Christ. Helmut Thielicke, the well-known German theologian, scholar, said this: we do well to grasp the tremendous implication of this thought, for it is to the effect that my acceptance by God cannot be taken for granted, and that Jesus' death on the cross for me cannot be taken for granted. We European Christians have gradually become accustomed to the dangerous and unhealthy idea that the grace of God is thrown at us. Voltaire cynically said of the forgiveness of God, it is His job. But this is not so. These things are quite different from the popular assumption. The kingdom of God is not thrust upon us. The grace of God can also be silent. It is in no sense the duty or obligation of Jesus to bear my sins or to take me through the black gate of death. But if He does this, it cannot be taken for granted. And I make bold to say that even the most orthodox churchman will not enter the kingdom of heaven unless he is continually surprised that mercy has been shown to him. So again, there is this warning to us who are within the ranks of Christendom even within the ranks of evangelical, born-again Christianity. Do not be arrogant. Do not congratulate ourselves that we are standing in this place of blessing and privilege, because even as it happened to the Jews, it can happen to us to have it removed. And then verses 23 and 24, as we look at those quickly. And they also, that is the Jews, if they do not continue in their unbelief, in other words, if they come in faith, will be grafted in. For God is able to graft them in again. For if you were cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree, and were grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more shall these who are the natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? The wild olive tree, of course, bears bitter, shriveled, hard fruit. And we were grafted into this cultivated tree. God has done the miracle of producing an entirely different kind of fruit, which is contrary itself to nature, and we have been able to be grafted in. But what about the natural branches? Not these wild olive branches, but the natural ones. And how much more God will graft them in if they will come in faith. And so there will be, this is talking again about the restoration of Israel, that they, the natural branches, how much more they will fit into this olive tree. And we come to this that now Paul has been yearning to touch on all the way through these passages in verse 25. For I do not want you, brethren, to be uninformed of this mystery, lest you be wise in your own estimation. Again, this is the third warning now. There's a warning at the beginning of verse 18 about arrogance and pride. At the end of verse 20, do not be conceited, but fear. Now the third time, lest you be wise in your own estimation, lest you become conceited. That a partial hardening, not a total, but a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And so we have here this mystery that's mentioned. A mystery, of course, is a past or a future secret purpose of God. It has been hidden, has been covered, and now is being made known. And here is one of the mysteries that is spoken about in the New Testament. This is a future purpose that has been made known now, and we see it very clearly defined for us at the end of verse 25, that a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And I think that we see historically, we even see today, if we've ever had any contact with Jews in trying to lead them to Christ, that there is this hardened attitude or resistance toward the gospel. Now, some of them have been hardened by God because of their own hardness of heart, and most Jews, practically all Jews, are hard to win, and some of them can be won and are being won in a, comparatively speaking, in a phenomenal way today. But the majority are hardened until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And the Jews for Jesus, for example, have found this. They've gone into areas and they have gotten violent reaction from their other Jews, their fellow countrymen. And it wasn't too long ago in New York City that 2,000 Orthodox rabbis gathered together. And they gathered together for the purpose of somehow dealing with this subject of the ravages, the inroads that the Jews for Jesus movement was making among their flock, among their ranks, especially their young people. And they said at that time that there were at least 5,000 Jews for Jesus in New York City at that moment. Well, it turned out as they checked with the Jews for Jesus office that there were 30 of them, including the secretaries. But somehow their reaction and their resistance was so overly reactive that they pictured 5,000 of them being there in New York City at the moment. And this often has been the case. You try to reach Jews. I remember years ago with Campus Crusade at UCLA, where there's a very large segment of Jewish students there. The Campus Crusade did not go out and try to have meetings in the fraternity and sorority houses of the Jews, because they knew that they would be stirring up a very, very big hornet's nest. And if they were invited in, that's fine, but they didn't try to get invitations and so on in those days. I don't know what they're doing now, but they knew the kind of reaction that they were going to get, and at that time decided not to stir up a hornet's nest. But you'd think, certainly their rejection is not because they are not intelligent. They're among the most intelligent people of all the world. Just per capita, the Jews are probably the most intelligent group in all the world. It's not because they are not religious. They've been one of the most religious groups in all the world. And you would think that when someone came along, and as Susan Upshaw shared with us last Sunday, that when the real message got through to her, that this God that she believed existed, this God she believed in, and all that went with that she could know him personally, that began to ring some real chords in her heart. It really began to cause her to respond, that she could know God, this God that she believed in, she could know him personally and savingly without somehow trying to work her way through a merit system up to his approval. And you would think that when the message would come, that there would be great response in these very intelligent and very religious people. And yet, throughout history, there has been this very special hardening. This is part of the mystery. Hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And then we see this phrase, the fullness of the Gentiles. And this has been something new to me as I've studied this passage. And I've gotten excited about this. And I want you to get excited about it too, because I think it is phenomenal. We ask ourselves, now, what is the fullness of the Gentiles? The New International Version, I believe, translates it wrongly, where it says, until the full number of Gentiles has come in. In other words, throughout the generations, there's going to be so many Gentiles converted, and when that number hits, whatever it is in God's plan, then that's it. The context here would dictate against that translation. You noticed, as we looked last Sunday, at the word fulfillment in verse 12. Now, if their transgression, that is the Jews' transgression, be riches for the world, and their failure be riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their fulfillment be? There was a diminishing of riches on the part of the Jews, according to verse 12 and following. And yet it talks about a time of fulfillment of the Jews, of the fullness of spiritual riches that is still ahead for the Jews. That's the word, that's the exact same word as verse 25, the fullness of the Gentiles, the fullness and fulfillment. They're the exact same word in the original language. And in verse 12, again, fulfillment is being used of the fullness of spiritual riches, which the Jews are still going to experience. This unprecedented time of spiritual blessing is the way the word fulfillment is used in verse 12. And I suggest very strongly that it's the exact same word here, although it's translated slightly different in the New American Standard, but it's the same word, is this time of unprecedented blessing for Gentiles, this time of the fullness of spiritual riches for the Gentiles. And I believe what is being said here is that there is yet a time ahead for us in Christendom, which is basically a Gentile church. There is a time ahead where there will be a great sweeping spiritual awakening that will encompass the whole world and will be this fullness of the Gentiles, will be this unprecedented time that is still ahead for you and me. And I believe that there are traces of this around us right now. We don't have time to get into this morning, but we begin to look around and we begin to analyze the scene worldwide. And we see that there are things going on today that I believe are signs of this great spiritual awakening, sweeping spiritual awakening, which will be the fullness of the Gentiles, the fulfillment, the fullness of spiritual riches for the Gentiles, us in Christendom, the Gentile church. And instead of looking at the world scene and looking at a lot of the discouraging things and even the things within our own society, how we ought to be challenged with Israel now regathering in the land and many of these signs going on, that along with it, that we, perhaps, and I'd say even probably within our lifetime, will be part of this great spiritual awakening that will sweep the world before Christ returns and Israel, all of Israel, is saved. And that we are living in a day of unparalleled opportunity rather than retreating and somehow trying to isolate ourselves off from the evils that are increasing around us. And may this be a challenge to us to look at the scene. And here we have, I believe, there's some ambiguity here in this interpretation, but I believe that this is really what it's saying, is that right before all Israel is saved, as it goes on in verse 26, and thus making a logical connection between the fullness of the Gentiles, the fullness of spiritual riches among the Gentiles, and then all Israel will be saved. And now he quotes some Old Testament passages there about really that refer to the second coming of Christ. These things did not happen in the first coming. They obviously refer to the second coming of Christ and what's going to happen to all of Israel. And so we have all of Israel being described here. And as the passage goes on, from the standpoint of the gospel, they are enemies. That is, the Jews right now are enemies for your sake. But for the standpoint of God's choice, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers. In other words, he still has a plan for them. He still will fulfill those covenant promises that he made to Abraham and the patriarchs. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. This is going to happen, and I believe it's going to happen right after this worldwide spiritual awakening that we have never known before in the history of the church. There have been some in the past, obviously, but this that is referred to as the fullness of the Gentiles. Now let's take the last few minutes in some application to our own lives here. And as I pointed out a few moments ago, there are three warnings to us about arrogance, about pride, about this self-congratulating spirit of being the privileged of God, the people of God, and kind of sitting and resting on our laurels. Three warnings there, verse 18, verse 20, and verse 25. And there is perhaps no other passage in all of the Scripture that really applies to us in the United States of America more today than these three warnings. There are such parallels between the Judaism and the United States today. Many parallels of the privileges of the two groups. I was talking with one of our businessmen here in Austin this last week, and he was sharing with me that as he became a Christian a few years ago, he thought he had this whole thing of materialism settled. He thought he had this whole thing of his life being wrapped up and his self-worth being wrapped up in materialism and his job and so on, settled. And then, all of a sudden, he realized that he didn't have it settled, that it was so subtle and powerful a thing. And I believe this is one of the things. This whole thing of materialism and worldliness is one of the things that desensitizes us as individual believers to really laying hold of God's fullness and God's great blessing for us in the midst of the unparalleled opportunity really that we're in today. And he described that his job began to kind of go dry on him. And this good job, this good position no longer was making money. And the impact it began to make on his own sense of self-worth and how he began to realize that so much of his life was still wrapped up in these outward status symbols of success. A good job, how much money we make, the kind of a house we live in, the car we drive, the clothes we wear, and how this was hitting him very, very hard. And I shared with him, I said, no, I haven't had the same problem, but I had something parallel in principle. And that is in our first church in California. I worked very hard for a number of years, and finally we bought property and we built a building, and when we moved into the building and so on, we doubled or even tripled our growth, and everything was moving along, and I was beginning to look like a success, finally, in life. You know, from maybe my vantage point and maybe some others and so on, but there were some outward status symbols of success. And then all of a sudden we had a semi-church split. And the service, instead of that little auditorium being full, it was half full within a week or two. And we used to have up on the side of the building, and we posted how many we had in Sunday school, you know, and it posted the year ago plus what it was today, you know, and you know, status symbols of failure all around, and how that devastated me, because and to a large extent I was building my life around these outward measurable status symbols of success. Numbers, how much people gave, how many baptisms, and these kind of things. And how that really floored me, but became God's opportunity to get through to me in a way that was absolutely life-changing in its implications. And I decided not to play the numbers racket anymore after that, and decided to be content to let God use me in the way He chose to use me. And I believe we had the most effective year of our ministry there after that thing happened. And our whole society, as it's wrapped up in this whole thing. And you ask the average college student, what's your main goal in life? Well, to get my degree so I can get a good job and make good money. The cool image, the big bucks. You ask the average college student, and that's exactly what they'll tell you. And we find that our whole society is saturated with this. The media continues to feed this to us, and we find it on every side, and it is a fulfillment of what Francis Schaeffer has been saying, that our society is deeply influenced by all of this, and certainly the church is deeply influenced by this. Of personal peace. Don't bug me, I want to do my own thing. Personal peace, and then the affluence. I want things. I want the money to buy the things. And our whole society being built on more and more consumption. And God is going to break that, as someone has called it, the culture of narcissism, this self-absorption, this meism is going to break the back of materialism. And I believe within our lifetime here in the United States. There's a couple of alternatives. One is a very merciful alternative, and that is to send us through hard times as a nation, economically, so that we can get our value system re-straightened, of which we are very heavily influenced by as born-again Christians. The other is that our freedoms would be removed, and this is what Francis Schaeffer keeps telling us. He was asked recently in Dallas, what about this process of our losing our freedoms? What's happening to it now? He said it's speeding up, if anything. And that he was asked further, well, what will become of us as Christians then, if we do lose our freedoms? And he said, well, we will be like Christians in Russia today. This is a good example of what our lives will be like as we continue to move along in this culture of narcissism, this culture that is committed more and more consumption and more of gratifying these material things, these material desires. And so we need to respond to the challenge of being on the brink of an unprecedented spiritual awakening and lay aside these things that are desensitizing us, absorbing our lives, and decision after decision is made on the basis of wanting to have these outward status symbols of success, or God's will, perfect will for our life many times. And I'm afraid that we are making many of our decisions, and much of our self-worth is wrapped up in wanting to have the outward status symbols rather than what God really has for us. I was talking to one of our men the other day. I said, what are your goals for this next year? What do you want God to do with your life? And he said, I want to win somebody else to Christ, and then I want to disciple that person. I want to nurture that person in the faith. I want to mother that person spiritually. What a beautiful goal. That means that he's having to lay aside certain things, certain of the affluent status symbols of our society even, to achieve a goal like that. This is his goal before the Lord. And I thought to myself, wow, boy, that needs to be my goal too. And I need to lay aside whatever is going to hinder, whatever is going to block that whole process, and at least be instrumental in leading one person. That means I'm going to have to affect a number of people's lives, but to personally lead one person to Christ and begin to nurture them in the faith. And that means cutting down, I believe, very seriously in some areas of our life in order to accomplish that. And I'm beginning to pray that very specifically for my own life. And I would challenge you and encourage you to begin to pray that same thing for your own life. And in the midst of what I believe, as we presented in this passage, on the brink of an unprecedented spiritual awakening worldwide, that we might have the marvelous privilege of participating in what God is going to do in a very direct and free and fruitful way. May God enable us to do this. Let's close together in prayer.